Hello, my name's Casey Strine, and I'm pleased to be here with Dr. Sarah Irving, who is going to speak to us about some of her research on a gentleman called Yusif Kanaan. Sarah, it's lovely to have you with us today. Could I just start by asking a little bit about your research and how you got interested in Yusif Kanaan as a figure and as someone to explore his life and his interaction with the Palestine Exploration Fund?
I was actually looking in the PEF's archives for material on somebody else. And I was kind of going through various different boxes in the archives. And it started to occur to me that there was an awful lot more in both published and unpublished material from the Ottoman period, so pre-World War I in Palestine, about, that actually did feature local people, what they were doing, what they were saying, what the interactions between them and the various European or American origin employees of the Palestine Exploration Fund, how they were participating and interacting with one another. And one of the main figures that came out of that was Yusif Kanaan. Initially, he's mentioned in one or two pieces of writing about archaeology in Palestine in this period, but because there are two Yusifs, previously they've tended to be conflated, and that Yusif Kanaan particularly, who starts working with the PEF in 1890, actually has much more longevity in terms of actually being part of that organization and that setup and witnessing what happens on their excavations than any of the European kind of so-called experts. He's there from 1890 until World War I. And that's a really interesting opportunity to think about who's doing archaeology in Palestine in this period and what it means to be doing it.
You've said that Kanaan is introduced to the PEF around 1890, and he starts as a cook. So could you say a little bit, you mentioned that there are two Yusufs. Tell us a little bit about this Yusif Kanaan, starting as a cook. How does he end up being a figure involved with the PEF's excavations at all?
So he is involved, we don't know exactly how, but from a young age, with the very large community of Protestant American missionaries in Lebanon who had been there for decades by the 1890s. And he comes to Palestine as a cook for the Palestine Exploration Fund excavations with a leading figure from this American Protestant missionary community, a man called Daniel Bliss, who was the son of the founder of the Syrian Protestant College, what is now the American University of Beirut. And when Daniel Bliss takes up the job of running the PEF's excavations in Palestine, he brings both of the Yusufs with him. There's Yusif Kanaan, who already seems to have some kind of archaeological experience and comes as the overseer, as the supervisor on the excavations. And he's a mature man. He seems to probably be in his 40s. And they also bring with them Yusif Kanaan, the 16-year-old boy who comes along for a job as the cook. 6 years later, Yusif Kanaan dies unexpectedly of pneumonia in Jerusalem during one of the excavations, and Daniel Bliss needs a supervisor very quickly because he's excavating on several small sites and he can't be on all of them at once. So he needs someone fast who has experience, who can deal with the language differences and things like this. Bliss is fluent in Arabic. He'd actually been born in Lebanon, but there are other Palestine Exploration Fund kind of visitors and things like this who do need translation for them as well, and to deal with things like logistics and all of that side of what's happening on the excavations. So he at first temporarily promotes Kanaan because he's there, he's watched how these digs work for the last 6 years, and he's available. And actually, he turns out to be really good at what he's doing. And so they keep him on until basically about 1913 through several other different excavation leaders for the PEF.
So we're going to talk in a moment. There's a sort of division in Kanaan's career. He works on excavations, and then at the end, he works on a survey. But excavation-wise for PEF, and then for the Germans in Baalbek, he's in lots of different places. He proves himself early on, as you say, by being useful logistics and that sort of stuff. But he comes to be a much more influential and prominent figure in the actual archaeological work. Can you talk a little bit about sort of where he works, and how is it that he proves his worth such that he becomes a more and more prominent figure in the actual archaeology proper, I guess, as we would say, that's happening under the PEF's direction?
Yeah, so as you say, he has experience on a whole range of different sites, with Bliss, and then with RAS Macalister, and then with Duncan Mackenzie. And so he's at el-Hesi to start off with Bliss, in Jerusalem, at sites in the Beit Jibrin area, at Gezer. This whole string of different places with lots of different experiences, lots of different challenges. What that means is he's seen lots of different things. He has a comparative perspective that many of the sort of more officially senior excavators don't really have. So what we start to see little mentions of in the writings, and of course this is stuff that's being written by Bliss, Macalister, and Mackenzie. There's very little of Yusif's own voice in any of this, as we'd find with most colonial archives. But you start to see things like Macalister talking about an incident where there was a find of some particular, I think, ceramics, and there's kind of a discussion that happens with the other sort of expert figures that are present at the site. But then they realize that Yusif might well have been at a site with similar things, and indeed he has. So he can draw these kind of direct comparisons with finds from other places, with how they were interpreted, with what the contexts and the other finds associated with objects might have been at other sites. And this very much kind of feeds into not just the logistics of the archaeology, but how finds are actually interpreted, certainly on site and to some extent when they're written up. He also sort of very informally at first, and possibly starting under Bliss, but much more formally under Macalister, undertakes what is basically ethnographic research as well. And this is part of the sort of idea that was current in archaeology at this time, that the native population in Palestine, the indigenous people of Palestine at that time, were somehow relics of the biblical civilization, and that ethnographic knowledge of them had the potential to inform archaeological finds. So he's going out and asking people in the area of the excavations things like, what does this place name mean to you? What are the different place names for this? And sort of trying to work out if any of them might have significance for things like, in this period, as there's still the kind of obsession with trying to link local place names with biblical ones. So, he's going out and asking people in the villages and things about, stories, legends, traditions, all that kind of stuff, and feeding that back into the interpretive process.
Now, this is all happening out in Palestine. Some of this is being reported back. Some of this is what local people know. I mean, what do those people that are back here in the UK that are supporting and running the Palestine Exploration Fund and making decisions at home, as it were, about this. What do they know about Kanaan? What do they know about the role that that this person or people like Kanaan are playing in the work that's being done, and how significant it is for the way that it's being shaped and the results that it's providing?
They know a lot, but also very little. I think they know a lot in that the way that a lot of the kind of committee members and sort of bureaucracy of the Palestine Exploration Fund have kind of a genuine appreciation for the idea that Kanaan is a real mainstay of the excavations, but more on the logistical, practical, local knowledge level. So I think he is strongly appreciated in that sense. I don't think they have as much of an idea of what his intellectual contributions are, because what they're getting of those is always filtered through what Bliss or Macalister or Mackenzie are writing back, on the assumption that the times that we know about from those writings are not every single instance where this happened. They're only hearing about the same ones that we can now see in the archive. And therefore, I think we have to assume that there is a lot more going on. The Palestine Exploration Fund archive also holds a whole kind of box file full of sort of school notebooks, little exercise books, dating from between 1905 and 1913, that Kanaan used for collecting ethnographic material. And as far as anybody can tell, these simply haven't been looked at or used by the PEF or the people that were sort of publishing stuff. They're in Arabic, they're in handwritten Arabic, so it may well be that a lot of the people back in London couldn't read them. But I strongly suspect that they've just never really sort of been looked at because they hadn't been written up into English. So when, for instance, Macalister writes his various pieces on the Damari, he'll maybe, make a little reference to the fact that Yusif helped with things. But then when you go and look at these notebooks, you realize quite what the extent of that actually is, and how much work went into it from his end. So I think probably he was appreciated. There is a genuine sense in a lot of the material from the London end that they know that he's dependable and loyal and valuable to them, but it's on this logistical level. And the extent to which these things are shaped by the sort of gatekeeper figure of the lead archaeologist who's on the ground in Palestine, I think is illustrated by the way in which Yusif is treated reasonably well during the Bliss and Macalister periods, because Bliss is, as I said, it has been brought up in the Middle East. He's very sympathetic. He's very culturally attuned to the environment he's in. He has fluent regional Arabic. Macalister, although he has a reputation for being very curmudgeonly, and he's very negative about people in his writings. And somebody, when I was talking about Yusif once at a conference, somebody said, Macalister is really racist. I'm not sure for his time that Macalister was actually that racist. I think Macalister was just a misanthrope. He hated everybody, regardless of their culture or their ethnicity. He's actually quite honest and appreciative about Yusif. The problem arises after Macalister when Mackenzie joins, because Duncan Mackenzie really has a problem with Yusif. He is extremely racist about him. He makes a lot of comments in letters back and in his notes about how Arabs shouldn't be allowed to get above themselves. He sees Yusif as having, as not knowing his place. He should understand that he's there as a digger, as an overseer of diggers, as somebody who makes local arrangements, that he shouldn't be competing with Duncan Mackenzie for knowledge, for archaeological knowledge. And Mackenzie often obviously hugely resents this fact. And the kind of end of Yusif's time with the PEF just before World War One it's not acrimonious, but it's messy. Yeah. And they are perhaps not as generous as they could have been in terms of giving him a kind of severance payment once they realized that archaeology wasn't going to be possible in the region because of the war. Now, they obviously still appreciated his abilities, because once the PEF does start thinking about going back to Palestine in the Mandate period in the early 1920s, they try and bring him back, and he rejects the job offer because it's excavation is seasonal work. By this point, he married before the war, he's got a family, and he has a permanent job. So the implication is that while he's still interested in archaeology, and he's still interested in what the PEF do, he can't afford to come back to them. But it's them that go looking for him.
Now, there's an interesting gap in between those two that I'd like to ask you to fill in a bit. Not only because I think it's helpful in us understanding Yusif Kanaan's skills and his value to the PEF, but because it relates to figures that everyone is always fascinated about. And that has to do with the survey in the Wilderness of Zin, and with Woolley and, of course, Lawrence. So as the period of excavation is sort of coming to the end, as some survey work, which had been obviously the focus of the fund before we started digging, emerges again as something that people are interested in for various reasons. That survey is set up. Can you say a little bit about how Yusif Kanaan was and was not connected with the survey, and what his experience of that work was?
So what had effectively happened by about 1913 is that Duncan Mackenzie, who had been the last of the sort of in-place excavators for the PEF, he was quite a prickly figure. As I said, he was deeply racist about Arabs. He also was a very severe alcoholic and was effectively drinking himself to death. And he made himself very ill on several occasions when he was working for the PEF. And in the end, they basically fired him. Now, that was very acrimonious. As I said, he obviously resented Yusif. So there's stuff going on there as well. And there are several other people in the country at this point who are kind of acting as go-betweens here. And as you say, one of the things that the PEF finds itself doing at this point, just before the war, is kind of filling in the gaps from the survey of Western Palestine, this great big kind of military survey that they had done decades earlier. But that survey hadn't covered southern Palestine, what is now known as the Negev Desert, Gaza, that kind of area, and the Wadi Arabah, the what is now the border between Israel and Jordan. And it's decided by the British military that this would be something that would be useful and desirable to have properly mapped. And to do this, they hire, as you mentioned, T. Lawrence, who will soon become Lawrence of Arabia, and Leonard Woolley, who becomes a very well-known archaeologist later on. They have experience of digging in sort of further north in the region at Carchemish. They're both pretty young still at this point, but they have archaeological experience. But they don't necessarily know southern Palestine particularly well. So Yusif is kind of effectively sent as the sort of guide and fixer, and this sort of typical role that he was used to undertaking. However, they don't seem to have gotten on, whether Yusif is already kind of jaundiced by his experience with Mackenzie, whether there's a personality clash. Lawrence has brought with him a young Syrian man who some people think was possibly his partner, certainly a close friend. So again, this is part of the kind of messy, at times acrimonious ending that never really has any sort of proper closure that we can see in the letters for Yusif. And there's various kind of questions at the end of this about his pay, about whether the PEF are going to kind of give him any sort of severance money and this sort of thing. So it's an untidy ending to, you know, a relationship that's gone on for nearly quarter of a century by this point, and that had been, at least to some extent, quite mutually beneficial, certainly for the PEF, but to some extent for Yusif as well. He was genuinely extremely interested in the archaeology. You know, at one point he teaches himself classical Hebrew so that he can read inscriptions on the sites that they're working on. So yeah, it's a very untidy end, and on one level we can put that down to sort of impending conflict in the region, although to some extent that's a bit of a teleological way of thinking about it, because it wasn't that obvious that the Ottoman Empire was going to join the war on the side of the Germans.
If we think back from sort of 1890 through to the early 1920s, almost 30 years of Kanaan's life. He goes from being a cook, coming from what we now think of Lebanon, to this area, working on probably as many or more digs than any of the famous archaeological names that we would know from the period, being both welcomed and valued, learning all sorts of skills. What is that? How does that reframe our understanding of the period? What are you, I guess, what are the lessons about thinking about how archaeology was done, what we know about it, maybe where we need to go and tug at the threads a bit more to see what was happening? Would you say are the lessons that you take away and that maybe we should think about taking away from the story of Kanaan's particular interaction with these figures and these sites in this work?
I think the first lesson that we need to take away is that there is a tendency to see archaeology as something that white people do in other people's countries. And I am absolutely not diminishing the importance of colonial power relationships, of the destructiveness that colonial archaeology has had in so many different parts of the world, of all of the, you know, terrible things that have been done in the names of archaeology and ethnography by colonial scholars, explorers, whatever they sort of saw themselves as. But I think what a figure like Kanaan does is complicates the idea that it's a unidirectional relationship when it comes to the creation of knowledge, the shaping of knowledge, the shaping of understandings. I think we can see in the archive Yusif having these little moments of influence in what's going on. I think the second way that we need to think about him is in terms of the social history of the region, and the role of archaeology within that. Now, you know, we can sort of say it's very minor. It's something where there, you know, at this time there's maybe 2 or 3 digs happening each year in Palestine, for instance. But this is the era of the great destructive excavations. These digs are often employing hundreds of people. They are a significant source of wage labor, sometimes for years in one place. So not just looking at these kind of middle level educated figures like Kanaan, but also looking at the many local men and women who acted as manual laborers on these digs. And the fact that I think there's a bit of a tendency to assume that that is something static, that a dig turns up, it uses labor from the local village, it goes away, end of relationship. And I think what we're increasingly understanding is that that's not necessarily the case, that there is a kind of small professional stratum developing of people who travel within the region in these jobs, or who pick up these jobs for a number of different employers. So there are also mentions during Bliss's Jerusalem excavations of him hiring men who had worked on PEF digs for people like Warren years earlier, and who still had specific skills in terms of things like archaeological carpentry, shoring up excavations and tunnels and things. And we see this also with Quirk's book on Petrie's excavations. And when Flinders Petrie comes to dig in Palestine, he brings Egyptians with him who have had years of experience, particularly from the sort of famous Kuftis, who've had years of experience at doing this, and he brings them as overseers and trains people. And we keep seeing this in the social history of Palestine. So, I mean, even sort of decades later, one of the Tamera Bedouin, who is best known for being one of the three shepherds who found the first Dead Sea Scrolls, also he stays in archaeology to some extent. He's going off and working for excavations in the Nablus area years later. So this is part of sort of regional social and labor history, people's relationships in this colonial setting with archaeologists as employers, but also with archaeologists as people who are revealing or creating knowledge and narratives about their land. And these are not just narratives that are known by other scholars in the West. They are things that feed back. There are feedback loops going on in all of this. So even if the numbers that we're thinking about are comparatively small, it's something that needs to be considered as part of the way in which people in the region interact with their own histories, on both an intellectual and a kind of physical level, on the level of the land and what's in it and under it.
I'm afraid to say that we're coming towards the end of our time, but it's been lovely to, as it were, excavate a bit of Yusif Kanaan's life with you, Dr. Sarah Irving. Thank you for sharing that with us. And it has been a wonderful learning experience for me, as I'm sure for others. And we look forward to hearing more both about Yusif. You can read more in Dr. Irving's article in PEQ, The Two Yusifs, which we'll link to from this, and also hopefully in further work on some of these unpublished journals. So thank you so much for your time and your knowledge.
Thank you so much for having me.